Introduction. The story that changed everything. Deep within the pages of ancient texts lies one of the most controversial and mind-bending stories ever recorded. It's a tale that involves supernatural beings, forbidden relationships, giant offspring, and consequences so severe that they allegedly led to the complete destruction of the ancient world. This is the story of the Watchers, the fallen angels who made what many consider to be the biggest mistake in biblical history. While most people are familiar with the story of Noah's flood, fewer know about the events that supposedly led to this worldwide catastrophe. According to ancient Jewish texts, particularly the Book of Enoch, 200 angels descended from heaven, took human wives, and set in motion a chain of events that would corrupt the entire earth and force God's hand in bringing about total destruction. This story has fascinated theologians, scholars, and conspiracy theorists for thousands of years. It raises profound questions about the nature of divine beings, the boundaries between heaven and earth, and the consequences of crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. Whether you approach this from a religious, historical, or simply curious perspective, the implications of this ancient account are staggering. The biblical foundation, where it all begins. The story starts in Genesis 6:1-4, one of the most debated passages in the entire Bible. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children with them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." This brief passage has sparked centuries of debate. Who exactly were these sons of God? The text is frustratingly vague, but it sets the stage for one of the most dramatic stories in ancient literature. While the Bible itself provides only this cryptic introduction, other ancient texts fill in the shocking details. The immediate consequence mentioned in Genesis is telling. God limits human lifespan to 120 years, and then, just verses later, decides to destroy the world with a flood because every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The implication is clear. Whatever happened with these sons of God and human women led directly to the moral corruption that necessitated global destruction. The Book of Enoch. The full story revealed. To understand the complete scope of this cosmic disaster, we must turn to the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that was widely read and quoted in biblical times. While not included in the modern Bible, it provides the detailed account that makes sense of the Genesis passage. According to Enoch, 200 angels called Watchers were stationed on earth to observe humanity. These weren't ordinary angels, they were powerful beings with significant knowledge of heavenly secrets. Their leader was Semjaza, also called Shemazai, and they included other notable figures like Azazel, who would later become associated with the scapegoat ritual in Jewish tradition. The Watchers were meant to watch, not interact. They were supposed to be observers, keeping their distance from human affairs while reporting back to heaven. But something went terribly wrong. The fatal attraction. When angels fell for beauty. As humanity multiplied across the earth, the Watchers found themselves increasingly fascinated by what they saw. Human women, in particular, caught their attention. The text describes how these divine beings became consumed with desire for mortal beauty. This wasn't a sudden impulse. According to the account, the attraction grew over time as the Watchers observed human relationships, families, and the intimate bonds between men and women. They witnessed something they had never experienced in their heavenly existence: physical desire, emotional connection, and the creation of new life through union. The problem was fundamental. Angels were never designed for physical relationships. They existed in a different realm, with different purposes. Their nature was spiritual, not physical. But desire, once awakened, proved impossible to resist. Semjaza, their leader, initially hesitated. He understood the magnitude of what they were considering and feared he alone would bear the blame for such a transgression. But his fellow Watchers convinced him by swearing an oath together. All 200 would participate, sharing both the pleasure and the punishment. This collective decision was crucial. It wasn't a single angel going rogue. It was an organized rebellion involving 200 of heaven's appointed guardians. They knew they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. but their desire had overcome their divine wisdom. The descent. 200 angels choose earth over heaven. The moment of descent is described as both magnificent and terrifying. 200 powerful beings abandoning their heavenly posts and choosing to manifest in physical form on earth represents one of the most significant rebellions in cosmic history. They descended upon Mount Hermon, a location that would later become significant in various religious traditions. The very name Hermon is said to derive from the Hebrew word meaning devoted to destruction or cursed, a fitting place for such a momentous transgression. Upon arriving on Earth, the Watchers took on physical forms that allowed them to interact with humans. This transformation itself was unprecedented. Angels weren't meant to inhabit physical bodies or experience physical sensations, yet they altered their very nature to pursue their desires. The Watchers then spread out across the earth, each choosing women who appealed to them. They didn't ask permission or follow human customs. They simply took what they wanted, using their supernatural power and knowledge to overwhelm any resistance. These weren't equal relationships. The power imbalance was absolute. Divine beings with supernatural abilities taking human women who had no choice in the matter. The women became wives in name, but the reality was far more complex and troubling. The forbidden knowledge. Secrets that changed humanity forever. The Watchers didn't just take human wives. They shared knowledge that was never meant for human minds. This may have been their most devastating mistake, even worse than their forbidden relationships. Azazel, one of the most prominent Watchers, taught humans how to make weapons of war. He showed them metallurgy, how to forge swords and knives, spears and shields. Before this, humanity had no knowledge of warfare on such a scale. Conflicts were settled with stones and sticks, not crafted instruments of death. Other Watchers shared different forbidden secrets, cosmetics and jewelry, leading to vanity and superficial obsessions, astrology and divination, allowing humans to try to predict and control the future magic and sorcery, giving mortals access to supernatural powers, advanced mathematics and science, far beyond what humanity was ready to handle. This knowledge transfer was catastrophic because humanity wasn't spiritually or morally prepared for such power. Imagine giving nuclear weapons to ancient civilizations. The knowledge itself becomes a source of destruction when placed in unprepared hands. The Watchers essentially fast-forwarded human development by thousands of years, skipping the natural progression that would have allowed for the gradual development of wisdom alongside knowledge. The result was a species with God-like knowledge but still possessing human weaknesses, desires, and capacity for evil. The Nephilim. When heaven and earth collided, the unions between the Watchers and human women produced offspring that defied all natural order. These children, called the Nephilim, were neither fully human nor fully divine. They were something entirely new and terrifying. The Nephilim grew to enormous size, described as giants who towered over ordinary humans. But their size was the least of the problems they represented. These beings possessed supernatural strength, extended lifespans, and abilities that far exceeded normal human capacity. More troubling was their nature. The Nephilim seemed to inherit the worst traits of both parents. The power and pride of their angelic fathers combined with the physical appetites and moral corruption of fallen humanity. They became tyrants and oppressors, using their superior abilities to dominate and terrorize normal humans. The Nephilim had enormous appetites for food, for power, for violence. They consumed resources at an unsustainable rate and showed no restraint or mercy toward ordinary humans. Some accounts describe them as cannibalistic, turning to devouring humans when other food sources proved insufficient. These giants also continued the pattern of forbidden knowledge transfer. They taught humans even more destructive secrets, spreading corruption and violence wherever they went. They became the heroes of old and men of renown mentioned in Genesis, not because they were good, but because they were impossibly powerful and memorable. The corruption spreads. How evil multiplied. What started with 200 angels soon infected all of humanity. The presence of the Watchers and their offspring created a cascade effect that corrupted the entire world. The advanced knowledge shared by the Watchers led to an arms race among human civilizations. Nations that learned metallurgy and warfare from the Nephilim gained massive advantages over their neighbors. leading to unprecedented violence and conquest. Wars became deadlier and more frequent as superior weapons spread across the known world. The introduction of magic and divination corrupted human spirituality. Instead of seeking the true God, people began worshiping the Watchers themselves or turning to supernatural practices that opened doors to even more demonic influences. The line between the sacred and profane became completely blurred. Genetic corruption also became a major concern. The Nephilim didn't just stop with their first generation. They continued to intermarry with humans, creating a growing population of hybrid beings. Some traditions suggest that nearly all human bloodlines became contaminated with this supernatural genetic material. Environmental destruction followed as the enormous Nephilim consumed resources faster than they could be replenished. The earth itself began to suffer under the weight of these unnatural beings and their excessive appetites. Perhaps most significantly, the moral fabric of society collapsed entirely. When beings with godlike power showed no restraint or moral boundaries, ordinary humans followed suit. Violence became normalized. Corruption became standard. The very concepts of justice and mercy began to disappear. Heaven's response: when God says, "Enough." The situation on Earth couldn't continue indefinitely. The corruption had reached a tipping point where intervention became necessary to prevent total destruction of everything good and pure. According to the text, the cries of suffering humanity reached heaven. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, witnessed the devastation and brought the matter before God. They reported on the violence, corruption, and unnatural state of the world. God's response was swift and decisive. The Watchers had violated fundamental cosmic laws, and the consequences would be severe. But the punishment wouldn't just affect the rebellious angels. It would reshape the entire world. First, the Watchers themselves would be bound and imprisoned. They would watch as their children, the Nephilim, destroyed each other in warfare. There would be no escape, no reprieve, and no return to their former positions. They had chosen Earth over heaven, and now they would remain bound to Earth until the final judgment. The Nephilim would be allowed to destroy themselves through violence and warfare. Their uncontrolled nature would turn them against each other until none remained. This wouldn't happen overnight, but it was inevitable given their violent tendencies. Most drastically, God decided to cleanse the entire Earth through a global flood. The corruption had spread too far to be contained through limited intervention. Only a complete reset could eliminate the contamination and give creation a fresh start. The Great Flood. Ultimate consequences. The decision to flood the earth represents the most extreme response to any crisis in biblical history. It wasn't a localized judgment or a warning shot. It was total destruction, with the exception of one righteous family and representatives of each animal species. But why was such drastic action necessary? The traditional understanding focuses on human wickedness, but the fuller story reveals the true scope of the problem. This wasn't just about human sin. It was about the corruption of creation itself, at the genetic, spiritual, and environmental levels. The Nephilim had to be eliminated completely. Their supernatural nature meant they couldn't simply be reformed or rehabilitated. They were an unnatural hybrid that threatened the integrity of the human race and the stability of the physical world. The knowledge introduced by the Watchers needed to be forgotten. Humanity wasn't ready for such advanced understanding, and the only way to ensure a proper restart was to eliminate those who possessed this dangerous wisdom. The spiritual corruption required cleansing that went beyond individual repentance. Demonic influences had become so entrenched in human culture that only total destruction could eliminate them. Even the land itself had become defiled by the presence of these unnatural beings. The earth needed to be washed clean before it could again support pure human life. Noah and his family were preserved not just because they were righteous, but because their genetic line remained uncontaminated by Nephilim blood. They represented humanity as God originally intended it to be. The aftermath. Did the problem really end? The flood successfully destroyed the antediluvian world, but according to biblical and extra-biblical sources, it didn't completely solve the Nephilim problem. Genesis 6:4 specifically mentions that the Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward. How could giants exist after a flood that supposedly killed everything? Several theories have been proposed. Some suggest that the genetic contamination continued through one of Noah's daughters-in-law, allowing the Nephilim bloodline to survive the flood in diluted form. This would explain post-flood references to giants like Goliath and the Anakim. Others propose that the fallen angels, though bound, could still influence human reproduction in limited ways, creating new generations of Nephilim after the flood. This ongoing influence would explain why Israel was commanded to completely destroy certain Canaanite tribes that were described as giant descendants. A third theory suggests that the Watchers themselves weren't destroyed by the flood since they were spiritual beings. While their physical bodies may have perished, their spirits could have continued to corrupt humanity in other ways. The most troubling possibility is that the fundamental problem, the desire of supernatural beings to interfere with human affairs, wasn't resolved by the flood. It was merely postponed, with the potential for similar crises to arise in the future. Modern implications and interpretations. This ancient story continues to fascinate modern readers for several reasons. It addresses fundamental questions about the nature of evil, the limits of divine beings, and the consequences of crossing natural boundaries. From a theological perspective, the story explains the origin of evil in the world, without making God directly responsible for creating it. Evil entered through the free will choices of created beings who rejected their proper roles and relationships. Scientifically minded readers sometimes interpret the account as a primitive attempt to explain genetic anomalies, the development of early technologies, or encounters with advanced civilizations that seemed supernatural to ancient peoples. Conspiracy theorists find in this story evidence for ongoing supernatural influence in human affairs. They suggest that the Watchers or their descendants continued to manipulate world events from behind the scenes. Literary scholars appreciate the narrative as one of the earliest science fiction stories, exploring themes of genetic manipulation, technological advancement, and the unintended consequences of playing God. Regardless of how literally one interprets the account, it serves as a powerful warning about the dangers of crossing natural boundaries and the responsibility that comes with knowledge and power. Lessons from the greatest mistake. Whether viewed as literal history, symbolic narrative, or cautionary tale, the story of the Watchers offers several important lessons. The danger of unbridled desire. The Watchers allowed their desires to override their judgment and responsibilities. Their inability to control their appetites led to catastrophic consequences that affected the entire world. The responsibility of knowledge. Advanced knowledge without corresponding wisdom and moral development becomes destructive. The sharing of forbidden secrets caused more harm than good because humanity wasn't prepared to handle such power responsibly. The consequences of crossing boundaries. Some lines are meant never to be crossed. When divine beings attempted to live as humans, and when humans tried to achieve godlike status, the result was corruption and destruction. The importance of natural order. The story suggests that there's a natural order to creation that shouldn't be violated. When that order is disrupted, everything suffers. The reality of consequences. Actions have results that extend far beyond the original actors. The choices of 200 angels ultimately led to the destruction of an entire world civilization. Conclusion: the mistake that changed everything. The descent of the Watchers represents more than just a biblical curiosity. It's presented as the pivotal moment that transformed the ancient world and set the stage for all subsequent human history. What began as the attraction of 200 angels to human beauty ended with global destruction and the near extinction of humanity. This wasn't just the biggest mistake in biblical history. It was potentially the biggest mistake in all of history, if we accept the account at face value. The ripple effects of that original transgression supposedly continue to influence our world today. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, responsibility, desire, and the nature of good and evil. It suggests that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, some desires too destructive to pursue, and some boundaries too important to cross. Whether we interpret this account literally, symbolically, or as ancient mythology, its central message remains relevant. Choices have consequences, power requires responsibility, and some mistakes are too big to undo. The 200 Watchers learned this lesson too late, and according to the text, they're still paying the price. In our modern world of rapidly advancing technology, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence, perhaps the warning embedded in this ancient story is more relevant than ever. As we gain godlike powers over life, death, and the fundamental forces of nature, we would do well to remember the fate of those who crossed similar boundaries long ago. The story of the Watchers serves as an eternal reminder that with great power comes great responsibility, and that some mistakes are simply too catastrophic to survive.